First of all, I would like to thank you because your book gave me some really interesting insights and a lot of food for thought. And it also let me problematize my own experience. And I tried personally to respond to the question you addresses to teachers, not just by taking theoretical positions. What I would like to do now is to share with you what I have taken from that book and also to discuss some points with you in order to better understand your perspective and to explore more deeply some issues that particularly struck me. The first things I would like to talk about concerns your writing styles and your method, which are aspects that struck me the most in your book. And I would like to start from a passage that you mentioned on page 84, where a teacher says that if they had to represent their memory of the lesson, it would be like an impressionistic painting, whereas your account appears to them more like an high definition photograph. And I really liked this image. At sometimes, however, I would say that there is something impressionistic in your text as well, but in a positive sense. It is not a poorly objective description, but one can perceive the involvement of the witness, and this is what precisely struck me. This also emerges from your writing style, which is highly metaphorical. As you say on page 50, drawing on Lakoff and Johnson, metaphor is not just an ornament but a genuine form of knowledge. And it does not follow the classical scientific method but operates through a more playful and poetic shift, and however is not poetry for its own sake. It is communicative, it conveys knowledge, but in a different way, and in my view it fully succeeds in doing so. In this sense, I was also struck by what you call resonant particulars, that is, those apparently small details that are in fact very powerful. And I'm thinking, for example, of the latter between teacher and student you describe on page 9. And you suggested that there is a difference compared to other kinds of latter, and this really intrigued me, and I would be curious to know whether there are studies of different waves of laughing, and it felt like a kind of brushstroke, and precisely for this reason, it made me want to see like the whole painting. That is a more in-depth study of this theme. Just there are different, just as there are different ways of crying in young children, I imagine that laughter too may have many nuances, and the same applies to other details you mentioned, such as like responding to a sneeze or the place where the teacher is sitting. There are subtle but meaningful elements. In particular, I am very interested in the spatial dimension, so how in the classroom space, how the classroom space is configured, where the teacher is positioned in relation to the student, and this is something I had never fully problematized, but I have always felt it to be important, also in relations to my own interest in performative dimensions and LARP. More generally, I have the impression that this kind of knowledge is conveyed more efficiently through these brushstrokes than through a strictly scientific analysis, and this connects to another point that struck me on page 89. That is the idea that science explains, whereas arts concern meaning, and that human being tend more toward meaning that toward explanation, and this also seems consistent with your method. Your method itself interests me a great deal, especially in the way you conduct interviews. You use open questions, but very open ones and almost like disorienting. Some of them, as you point out, can be operatic. For example, what kind of teacher or person am I? And faced with such a question, a reaction of frustration is understandable. Something like you said, "Oh, I'm too busy. I never thought about that." And what I am wondering is how teachers manage to move beyond this initial difficulty. In the text, we see some of their responses, but I would be interested in understanding the concrete process. So, what did the dialogue look like? How did you move from such a broad question to a response that is not superficial, because the response were not superficial at all. So I would like to ask you, did you intervene with further question, or did you leave space for silence, allowing the teacher to first orient themselves, starting from such an open question? Because it seemed to me like a crucial point, how to avoid having superficial answer to such deep questions. This also interests me personally, because my own path has been somewhat divided. I started with qualitative research, and I also conducted interviews both with teachers, but especially with young children. Then, however, I moved to quantitative research based on data, where it is more difficult to see people involved. But in your work, by contrast, people fully emerge, and I would really like to understand your method better, because I have never concretely seen someone work that way. The interviews I conducted were semi-structured, with a fairly precise guide, and reflection tended to come at the end. Here, instead, I see that if it is as if one starts immediately from a broad reflection, placing the other person in a position that it's almost uncomfortable, but very fertile. The second point I wanted to discuss is the art of witnessing, which seems to me to be one of the central keys of the book. And I would like to connect this immediately to my personal experience, because I have carried out several observations in primary school, in addition to my internship, and it is precisely in these situations that I found it very difficult to put into practice this idea of remaining as an observer. And I was very struck by your ability to position yourself in a corner and simply observe, because at first glance this might seem like something easy, almost trivial, whereas in reality, in my experience, it is much more difficult to being than being actively involved. In fact, I found it almost impossible not to be involved in that sense. I remember in particular in a Montessori school, I was there with my notebook with the intention of observing, but it was practically impossible. There was not frontal teaching. The children would come with their own projects. They would ask me questions. They would ask me to look at what they were doing, to help them and to listen to them. And they clearly needed to share what they were working on with me. And so they inevitably draw you in. And they bring you into their world, and for me this was something almost irresistible, and I could not remain simply an observer. And for this reason I found this idea of yours particularly striking, because it highlights a real difficulty that of maintaining a presence that is not immediate intervention, but neither total detachment. And at the same time, in my observational experience, I recognized something that also emerges in the book when you report the testimony of teacher who speaks about a kind of synchrony that develops in the classroom, and I have perceived this synchrony as well, but I have never really problematized it, and it feels like a kind of positive tension that can also be sensed in a physical level. When it's there, you can clearly feel it, and it has something almost magical about it. And precisely for this reason, it seems difficult to reduce it to a set of instruction. It is not something that can simply be taught or replicated by following a method, and it seems like to arise spontaneously. So the question that came to my mind is if it is true that it cannot be fully reduced to method, it is still possible to understand what generates it. Is there something that fosters it? What triggers it? And who is able to create it, and how? And this then how is this synchrony between teacher and students constructed, which at times appear almost like an epiphanic moment. Another point that struck me concerns the theme of reflection on teaching. On page 34, you refer to Dewey, and I was particularly struck by the idea that teaching comes first and reflection comes afterwards. And the example you give, it's very clear when someone asks asks you for directions. You do not start reflecting on urban planning in that moment. You simply respond, and reflection comes later. And in the same way, I am listening to a student. When I'm listening, I'm not reflecting in that precise moment, and I'm simply listening and then responding. This made me think of one of my high school philosophy teachers who was decisive in my choice to study philosophy. And I remember that when someone asked him a question, even a student who was not considered particularly strong, he would not answer immediately. He would pause, really listen, and then take some time to think. And I clearly remember his gesture. He would look up for a few seconds and reflect. At first, this seemed strange for us, almost as if he were unprepared. If someone asked a question about a philosopher, one would expect an immediate answer. But in fact, this showed the opposite. He was not just responding mechanically, he was actually thinking. And in the end, this gave even more value to the student's question. In the book, however, you go beyond this level, because you mainly address a critical reflection on teaching, not only on a single question, but on the practice of teaching itself. And here I also strongly recognized myself in the opposite problem that you bring out at the central point, that of overthinking. Because it is true that reflection is fundamental, but it can also be counterproductive. I experienced this personally at the Scuola Normale Superiore, my university, where I was the only one interested in philosophy of education, and in particular in childhood, and also in practical sense through workshop and activities in school. And my peers would constantly push me to reflect on this vocation of mine, but they often saw it as something problematic, and my interest in children was perceived as excessive, almost suspicious, and this was difficult for me to defend myself because the question, why are you so interested in childhood, is not easy to answer. At a certain point, I also began to doubt myself. Perhaps my interest really was something strange, and this also had an effect of my practice with children. It is as if I began to be afraid of what I was doing. Every action became a problem, every gesture could be too much, and could be misunderstood in my mind, and I started to question everything continuously. And this constant suspicious was to me paralyzing. Then, at a later stage, I also began to question this doubt itself. I came to see that what I had been doing was not something strange, but that it might appear so to those who are not familiar with this kind of experience. Still, a strong tension remains for me. On the one hand, the importance of reflection, and on the other, the risk that it becomes excessive and blocks action. And this was particularly evident to me in a context like my university, the Normale, where reflection is central, but where I was also the only one bringing this more direct and human kind of interest. That was something that inevitably exposes one to this kind of questioning and difficulty. The final point concerns planning, which you address explicitly in some passages, but which, in my view, runs throughout the entire text. In particular, on page 137, you speak about the risks of planning too much, which can lead to a form of manipulation, and this also connects to an earlier point, namely the risks of indoctrination, the idea that learning cannot be forced. This struck me very much, especially in my own experience, because the activities I conduct are not lessons in the traditional sense, but a workshop, more specifically EduLARPs, and those experiences are in fact highly planned. A LARP requires a very intense preparation. There is certainly an element, of course, of flexibility and improvisation. Those are improvisations, but underneath there is an extremely structured design. And one of the central aspects is precisely this. The structure is hidden. It has to appear as something spontaneous, almost like a game, but in reality, everything is carefully thought out in detail. And this where a question arises for me. Is this a form of manipulation? Because on the one hand, the learner experiences the activities as free, but on the other hand, the environment is designed to produce certain outcomes. And in this sense, I'm also reminded of Rousseau, the idea of constructing an environment that guides you without imposing. And of course, in my case, there is a strong concern with avoid indoctrination, especially on a moral level. The aim is foster critical thinking, not to transmit content in a direct way or to instill a particular worldview. However, the question remains, where is the boundary between guidance and manipulation? Perhaps one difference is that in the case of LARPs, we do not define ourselves so much as teachers, but rather as facilitators. However, this does not eliminate the problem. If anything, it make it maybe even more subtle. At the same time, I'm aware that LARPs cannot be used all the time. They require very intensive preparation and remain particular immersive experiences, not easily replicable in every context. Still, a more fundamental question remains open for me, one that I have asked myself several times, but never had the chance to discuss it explicitly. What is the ethical status of this kind of practice, and to what extent is such a highly structured form of planning compatible with the idea of non-manipulative learning?